250, that's the number of medical device submissions that we've shipped at Blue Goat Cyber through the FDA. I've been building SBOMs, or software bill of materials, since 2014. This was long before they were mandated. They were recommended best practices. After Section 524B came out, it is now the law, and it's now mandated that you have an SBOM and the associated vulnerabilities with your SBOM for a submission. The problem is most medical device manufacturers treat the SBOM as a checkbox. It is not a checkbox exercise. It is something that needs to be done continuously and done correctly the first time. And if you create it in a way that it looks like it was created like a checkbox and you're just trying to fulfill the submission, the FDA will reject that. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through what we do at Blue Goat Cyber with our clients to help them with the SBOM and the vulnerabilities associated with SBOM and get their device cleared by the FDA and have their device actually stay on the market and remain secure. Let's dive into it. In this masterclass, we're talking about software bill of materials, or SBOM, and what the FDA actually is requiring for software bill of materials today. We'll talk a little bit about the history as well. But after Section 524B came out, the SBOMs have become mandatory, and because of that, they became a consistent challenge with 510K submissions and other regulatory pathways with the FDA. We're going to cover that in this masterclass. One of the most common deficiencies we see at Blue Goat Cyber with FDA submissions, pre-market submissions, are the SBOM is either missing or it's not done correctly. Unfortunately, we work with a lot of clients that have done a submission and they received a deficiency response from the FDA, and we help them with that deficiency response. And the number one thing we see is an incomplete SBOM, a non-machine readable SBOM, or lack of vulnerability descriptions in the SBOM, and we're going to cover those here. First off, what is an SBOM? The SBOM is a software bill of materials. It's all the materials, all the software components that make up your software. Developers don't write all the code themselves. They borrow code from third-party libraries. They find code on the internet, and all of that is the inventory of your overall software. And this includes transitive dependencies. A transitive dependency is simply a piece of software that goes into one of the other pieces of software you borrow, so it is the entire supply chain of that software. And this is just like if you buy a car, as an example, you want to know all the parts that make up the car so you can identify the vulnerabilities in the car. If you have a particular model of a car and the gas tank is prone to exploding if somebody rear-ends a car, then you have a vulnerability associated with that. It's the same thing with an SBOM, except it's software. We want to know through the entire supply chain where the vulnerabilities exist and what we're doing to mitigate those. And it goes along the lines of know thyself. It's hard to defend yourself or your environment if you don't know thyself. So why does the FDA care so much about SBOMs all of a sudden? It's been an evolution. I've been doing medtech cybersecurity since 2014. We did software bill of materials then. They were recommended, but they were not mandated. Now they are mandated as of Section 424B came out in December 2022, which became enforceable in March of 2023. After that date, the SBOM became a mandatory piece of a submission for a pre-market submission, 510K, PMA, de novo. It doesn't really matter on your submission pathway. The SBOM is required. And if you're missing an SBOM, you're going to get a deficiency. And we see a lot of deficiencies today. Last week, we had a couple clients come to us, or a couple prospects, that had tried to submit for a 510K submission. They did not do their SBOM properly, and they received a deficiency, and they came to us to try to help with that deficiency. So if you have a cyber device, which means it has software and any way to connect to it, you have to do a software bill of materials as part of your submission. And this is, as I said, it's no longer recommended or optional. It's now mandatory. The FDA doesn't really care which format you use for the SBOM as long as it is an industry accepted format. The two most commonly used formats are SPDX and CycloneDX. Most of the clients we deal with use SPDX. It doesn't really matter. That the key is that the format has to be machine readable. We've had clients come to us where they try to submit an SBOM in an Excel spreadsheet or a PDF document or a Word document, and those were not in a acceptable format because they were not machine readable, because the FDA wants to be able to ingest those using their tool, which is why they want it in a machine readable format. There's really 7 main fields from NTIA that go into an SBOM, and there's 2 that the FDA requires on top of that. So overall, you can look at this as 9 fields per SBOM component. Number 1 is the supplier name. So the author, organization, or upstream maintainer. Number 2 is the component name. This has to be exact, not ambiguous. It needs to be very specific as possible. The version as well has to be as specific as possible. That's number 3. You can't just say the latest version. It has to be the exact version of that software component. Other identifiers are useful as well. Those are typically in Perl or CP format. Any dependency relationships. You may have a software component that has a transitive dependency, as we referred to before. You may be pulling in a third-party library where that third-party library pulls in something else. We have to have that entire supply chain and trace the whole thing backward. We also have to know the author of the SBOM data and then the timestamp. And this is a very important thing to consider. When you're submitting an SBOM, it has to be your latest version of the software and timestamp, because a vulnerability today may change from low risk to high risk if a new exploit comes out for it. Or a component that has no vulnerability today, somebody may discover a vulnerability with it tomorrow. So the timestamp is super critical. The other 2 components that the FDA is looking for is the level of support for that component. Is it active, no longer maintained, abandoned? And this needs to be per component of the SBOM. And then the second thing they want is the end of support date. And this is often a challenge to find because sometimes these are open source things, projects that may be abandoned, but they want you to know when the end of support, if you can find it, is for that particular component of your SBOM. And this requires a fair amount of due diligence. And the SBOM is just the list of parts that make up your software. What's often confused is what VEX is. VEX is not actually required by the FDA, but it is a recommended standard. VEX is vulnerability, exploitability, exchange. So basically, once we have the SBOM, the list of what's in the device, all the inventory, all the components, we have to then look at what vulnerabilities exist with each of those components and what the real risk is in terms of patient safety to those components. You may have a vulnerability that may not have risk because it's inside the system and nobody can access that vulnerability. But this is where VEX comes in and where the vulnerability analysis comes in. We have to look at every one of those components and look at the vulnerability. It's kind of like the example I gave earlier of a automobile that has a gas tank that has a vulnerability, because if somebody runs into the car, the gas tank may explode and cause the car to catch on fire. That would be a vulnerability for that particular component in that specific model of the gas tank. It's the same thing with a particular model or particular component in software. The SBOM is just a list of the ingredients. It doesn't tell you anything about the vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities for each ingredient or each software component have to be assessed, and VEX is a format to do that. And VEX is also machine readable format. For VEX in any vulnerability assessment, there's a couple or 5 really things that make deficiencies come up very often. One, and we kind of touched upon this a little bit, is vulnerability is not a point in time study. It needs to be continuous. So if you're looking at a component that makes up your SBOM, it may have a vulnerability today, tomorrow it may have a higher vulnerability. So we have to continuously assess for vulnerabilities. VEX is a living artifact, just like the SBOM. You may add software, so your SBOM may expand. But even if your SBOM is static, you don't update your software, vulnerabilities may exist. So you continuously have to evaluate them using VEX or any other tool for new vulnerabilities. The number 2 is often people say that the component that makes up the SBOM is not affected. That is okay to say it's not affected, but you need to justify why it's not affected. And that could be the code is not an executable path. It doesn't matter your justification, but you can't just say not affected without the justification, because that will result in a deficiency. The third one there is the SBOM and VEX component mismatch. They need to be 1-to-1. So I have a software component. I do my vulnerability analysis against that specific software component. That has to match. It's a 1-to-1. And if there's a mismatch, the FDA is going to kick back your submission as a deficiency. They're not going to do the work for you and fix it. They're just going to say this is inaccurate and incomplete, and you have to fix it. The fourth mistake is a missing assessment for high CVSS scores. The higher a CVS score, the higher the risk, which means at face value, that component that makes up the SBOM may have a vulnerability that is super high risk. But you have to do the analysis to figure out, is it really that high of a risk based on its implementation in my software? Or is it not? And we have to do that analysis though. So that assessment needs to be provided for any high CVSS or CVEs in your software bill of materials. The fifth one there is the format mismatch. Sometimes if you have a CycloneDX VEX paired with an SPDX SBOM, that's going to trip up some reviewers. So pick a consistent format and tool chain and stick with it. And I've been talking about this a little bit with cybersecurity. It's not a point in time study. Risk evolve, exploits evolve, vulnerabilities evolve, and these things all tie together. So it's very important that you have a process behind how you build the software. A lot of clients will come to us and they'll do an SBOM right before submission, and they don't have a process behind how they're going to maintain the SBOM, how they're going to continuously look for new vulnerabilities, how they're going to ingest data from the SysACEV as example. And the FDA is going to reject that submission as well because they want to see that you actually not just do this as a one-time study, but do this continuously because, as I mentioned, threats constantly evolve. And what today could be low risk, tomorrow could be high risk if somebody publishes a new exploit on the internet that can easily take advantage of a vulnerability. So the stages of how to do this properly from a workflow perspective is when you build your software. This is stage one. Every time you do a new build, you should run a new SBOM and create a new SBOM. Stage two, you should scan that SBOM to look for vulnerabilities. Stage three, based on the vulnerabilities discovered and based on the VEX that came out of that, you should figure out which ones need to be fixed. And this should be based on risk. You should always fix the highest risk ones first, then go to the lowest risk later on. And some of the low risk may not even need to be fixed. We've had many clients submit SBOMs with a lot of risk as part of the SBOM, but they were super low risk and they did not need to be fixed. We've had clients that have had thousands of vulnerabilities in their SBOM, and they fixed the ones that they needed to fix, but they still had a couple hundred of low-risk vulnerabilities that were not dangerous to a patient, so they were acceptable. The fourth stage there is to publish the software after you've created the SBOM, the VEX, and you've done the triage. And then the fifth stage is where you submit the software. And this doesn't stop once you've submitted to the FDA. You have to continuously, every time you update the software, create a new SBOM and repeat stage one, stage two, stage three. And also what's important here from an overall post-market management perspective, it's required that you constantly scan your SBOM, your current SBOM, for new vulnerabilities. And then you have a process to mitigate those. So this is a very iterative process. And what we've noticed at Blue Goat Cyber is a lot of time the deficiencies have nothing to do with a bad device. It's really the submission didn't have the artifacts, including the SBOM or the vulnerability analysis of the SBOM to support what the FDA was looking for. Some of the SBOM's mistakes we see are those missing transitive dependencies. This is the first one. This is what I mentioned earlier. If I borrow a third-party library or piece of software, I have to know the software that went into that piece of software I borrowed. So I have to know from cradle to grave where every piece of software came from and what software went into that piece of software. So I have to have the entire software supply chain figured out. Otherwise, there might be something unknown that I can't trace back into that software bill of materials. And this includes software of unknown provenance, or SOUP. What SOUP means, if I trace back the software, I don't know where it came from. So that's a red flag. So I need to be able to trace it back. And if I don't know where it came from a transitive dependency perspective, I have to do a lot of analysis and justification as to why that software is acceptable in my product and that there's no vulnerabilities to that software. And we see this quite often. We see developers that will go online, find some source code that will help solve their problem for a particular function. They'll copy and paste the source code directly into their overall software, and they often leave default passwords and credentials in that code. So that's that software of unknown provenance, and that's what we have to look at, because obviously if I've got default credentials that are on the internet somewhere, that's a vulnerability somebody could take advantage of. The second common mistake we see in SBOMs is no vulnerability assessment. A lot of prospects of ours that get a deficiency, they'll submit a machine readable SBOM, which is a requirement, but they won't do the vulnerability assessment of all the components of the SBOM. As we mentioned before, the SBOM is important. It gives you all the ingredients or all the components that make up your software. That's step one, but we still have to look at all the vulnerabilities for every one of those components and check to see if they're valid. So we have to do number two. That is flagged very often. And then number three, I mentioned before a little bit as well, the SBOM needs to be current. If you generate it 10 months ago, 11 months ago, or even 2 months ago, and you've changed your software, then the SBOM is out of date and it's going to result in a rejection by the FDA. And going back to number two, if you change your software, you have to do another vulnerability assessment also. So this is like the continuous process we talked about earlier. And as I mentioned, you can't defend what you don't know exists. So the SBOM gives you the list of everything that exists, and then you can look at the vulnerabilities in that SBOM. Here's a little playbook. So 5 habits to drop and 5 to adopt. On the left side there, the fast path to a deficiency letter, which you don't want, is to generate the SBOM the week of submission. As I mentioned, this should be continuously part of your software build cycle. With the FDA is looking at from design to disposal. They want to see that you develop software securely along the entire pathway. So generating SBOM the week of submission is going to be troublesome because you probably haven't identified the vulnerabilities, and within 1 week, you're not going to be able to fix all those vulnerabilities either. A lot of people skip the transitive dependencies we talked about, but we have to know the entire supply chain. So everything that went into our software, where it came from, we have to be able to track that back. Any CVE that we mark as not affected is okay, but we need to justify why it's not affected and why it doesn't really bother or introduce a vulnerability into our product. I mentioned this before a little bit. We have seen lots of clients, they send the SBOM as a PDF, Excel spreadsheet. Those are not acceptable formats. We talked about SPDX and CycloneDX. Those are machine readable formats. Those are the formats the FDA wants to see. And the SBOM and the vulnerability assessment are linked together. They're not separate. Everything in the SBOM has to have a vulnerability assessment that aligns with that particular piece of code in the SBOM. Those are tied together. You can't divorce those two. So what you should do instead is generate the SBOM and the VEX on every build and sign them, digitally sign them, so we know they haven't been altered. We do the full dependency walk, so that means we know all those transitive dependencies. We can use a software composition analysis tool to help with that. If we're using VEX, we should use CISA-defined justification categories, so we need to be very specific. As I mentioned with SPDX and CycloneDX, they should be machine-readable formats. Those two are, so that's why we suggest you use one of those two, and that's what the FDA requires. And the SBOM and the vulnerability assessment have to be synchronized because they are tied together, and this is that continuous process as well. So ideally, you've taken something away from this masterclass, and you won't get a deficiency letter. You'll get cleared on your first submission. If you do get a deficiency letter, you can reach out to us and we can certainly help clear that.